All right, folks, we're back for more here, talking about the New Frontier and the Great Society. This will be our second part. If you recall from the first part, these are two names for the presidential time frames of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or JFK, and soon we're going to meet his vice president and ultimately his replacement, Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ. This took place, this particular time frame is 1960 through 1968, and we're going through some of the political and foreign issues that they addressed during their presidency. So, kind of picking up where we left off, let's take a look at what's going on. So one of the other things that happened early in the 1960s under President John F. Kennedy was the Berlin Wall was built by the Soviet Union. Berlin, if you recall, well, let's take a step back even further than that. Germany at the end of World War II was divided up into different sectors based on the different winning parties. There was an American sector, a British sector, a French sector, and a Soviet sector. And once kind of the Cold War began, and Russia faced off against the U.S. and its allies, really there became two different countries that were associated with Germany. West Germany, which was allied to the United States, and East Germany, which was allied to the Soviet Union. The old capital of Germany and the largest city of Germany was Berlin, which happened to exist within, geographically, the East German part of the country. And so one of the things that Khrushchev did was that he built a wall between East Berlin, which he controlled, and West Berlin, which the Americans controlled. Even though it was within East Germany, America and its allies still had control of part of Berlin. And Khrushchev was concerned with people going back and forth and kind of leaving the Soviet sector and going to the West, and that there'd be an opportunity for discussions and potentially spying. And so he built a wall literally right down through the middle of the city, and it happened almost overnight. He did this, Khrushchev did, who was the head of the Soviet Union, right after the Bay of Pigs, when he knew that the U.S. was vulnerable and the president was kind of at a lull because of how badly that had gone. So we have the situation where the wall is built, and it's a further example of the disconnect between the two countries and the walling off of relations between these two parts of one city. It becomes kind of a focal point, a metaphor, if you will, for the whole Cold War. And it's something that has many pictures, songs are written about it, all kinds of things happen up until 1989, 1990, when the Berlin Wall actually falls. About a year later, and I alluded to this in the first video, something happens that probably is as close as we've come that we're aware of as a society, as a people, to full-out nuclear war. We were within, potentially minutes to hours of being in a situation where we may have launched missiles towards Russia, which of course they would have retaliated. And it was over again, just like it was with the Bay of Pigs, Cuba. So after the Bay of Pigs, we talked about Cuba is run by Fidel Castro, who's a communist. He's allied to the Soviet Union. That's just right south of Florida. Matter of fact, if you look at the map on this picture, Kennedy is pointing towards Cuba, but that little thing that's sticking down at the very top of the picture, that's Florida. So that's how close Cuba is to Florida. And to have a Soviet satellite country that close was very concerning to the United States. One of the things that Khrushchev ultimately did is that he started to put weapons, nuclear weapons, in Cuba. And Fidel Castro allowed that to occur. And so now we're in the situation where Soviet-run and Soviet-built nuclear weapons are within just a few miles of the United States, and that's something that we couldn't allow. So we essentially, once we figured it out through our spy network and pictures that we had been taking with our spy planes, we told Cuba and the Soviet Union that they had to remove those. And this began a time frame of about 2 weeks where we played kind of what's, if you want to think about it, that game of chicken where who's going to blink first. This was that game, but on a global thermonuclear stage. And so ultimately what happened was some backroom deals were met, whereas the Soviets would take the missiles out of Cuba, and that we would then offer some concessions in Berlin and then also in Turkey. And none of that was ultimately talked about, but essentially what it looked like when it was all said and done is that the Soviets blinked first. They removed their missiles, and it was really kind of a win for the Kennedy administration, plus a win obviously for all of us that didn't have weapons that close to the United States. So once we get done with all of these issues, Kennedy is unfortunately a very short-time president, because about a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, right around Thanksgiving, on November 22nd, as a matter of fact, he is assassinated. He's killed. He's killed in Dallas, Texas. He's shot under some very kind of mysterious, potentially circumstances that still have conspiracy theorists up in arms today, but he's killed. And the issue then becomes the fact that we had this kind of wonderful new young vibrant president that's been shot down in his prime, and who would do such a thing? Was this a single crazy gunman, which is ultimately the way kind of the legal system worked it out? Was this a conspiracy with Russia and Cuba? Was this something that his more conservative foes did, or was it something from inside his own party because he was moving too fast on certain issues? So there's a number of different ways that this has been looked at over time. But regardless of what happened, on November 22nd, as he was in Dallas in a place called Dealey Plaza, he was shot from one of the upper windows of the Texas School Book Depository, a place where they would put all the books that would ultimately be sent out to the schools of the city of Dallas. He was shot from a window by a man named Lee Harvey Oswald and killed. He was not our first president assassinated, but he certainly was the first one to be assassinated essentially on TV. And there was video of the event and video, of course, of what happened right after. And as I talked about in the intro to our lesson, this is where people really, that day and those hours when he was finally pronounced dead are something that are stuck in people's memory forever. Part of the reason why this is such a big part of American history, the Kennedy assassination, is because it, as I said before, it's shrouded in mystery and conspiracy. So the man who ultimately was fingered or captured for the execution or for the assassination was a guy named Lee Harvey Oswald. And he had been a soldier, and he was kind of a malcontent, a misfit, but he had some odd connections. He supported the revolution in Cuba, and he was pro-Russian. As a matter of fact, had been to Russia prior to ultimately potentially shooting the president. And so, not only did he have some concerns, but he would have been connected with people, which made people think, was this something that the Russians or the Cubans orchestrated, with him being the actual triggerman? He was arrested very soon after the assassination. He was arrested in a theater. He'd also shot and killed a police officer that same day. The rifle that was used, which is the rifle that's being held up in this picture right here on this slide, was found at the book repository where he shot Kennedy. And so he was arrested, and they felt pretty good about the fact that they got their guy. However, before they could really interrogate him and figure out if this was a larger conspiracy, he was shot by another person and killed. So 2 days after he's caught for killing the president, he's shot and killed by a guy named Jack Ruby. And again, this fuels conspiracy about, was this something that people were doing to try to shut him up so that he couldn't talk about other people? So there's been thousands of books, tons of movies written and directed about this particular issue, and people still have their own minds about what happens. At this point, legally, that's the story, is that it was a lone gunman, and his name was Lee Oswald. And the people that came up with that were an organization called the Warren Commission. So the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, to try to get to some sort of clarity on this issue, this assassination, puts the Supreme Court justice together with a whole bunch of federal folks and makes a commission called the Warren Commission. And their goal is to try to figure out exactly what happens so it can be sent out to the United States, the people of the country, and we won't be shrouded in this kind of gray mist anymore about what actually happens. And unfortunately, because there's so many pieces of the ultimate report that they put out that are inconclusive and a little bit strange and don't make a lot of sense in terms of about could this actually really happen, is that it just makes the conspiracies worse. And like I said, we're still dealing with this issue even today. What we can all agree on is that his assassination, JFK's assassination, was really the end of an era. And his presidency was called Camelot, because Camelot back in the old stories of King Arthur was this beautiful, idyllic place where people treated each other well, everybody was vibrant and happy, there was energy, there was things happening, and that was the feeling that at least the people of the United States felt about JFK, his family, and his presidency. And this ended that. Obviously, it devastated the country and even the world, because he was an incredibly popular president around the world as well, and led to people really questioning this excitement that they had at the beginning of the 1960s, that they could, this end of the innocence, if you want to think of it about that way. There was also a lot of stuff going on at the same time. This was the very beginning of a lot of social changes. The civil rights era was really ramping up during this time frame. Women's rights, a number of different things happening, and very soon we will be getting into one of the ugliest wars the United States has ever fought, Vietnam, in a big way. And so at the end of all this, Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes the new president. He is going to move in a direction that he thinks would be consistent with what the former president, JFK, would have done, but takes on his own tenor. And that's really the next section that we're going to be talking about, associated with the Great Society. But before we do that, a little bit about LBJ. He was an interesting guy. He was a true politician. He had been in politics since he was a young man, and he really looked at politics as horse trading or deal making. He was a deal maker. He could figure out a way to get you to do what he wanted you to do, even if you said you wouldn't do it. He was a true deal maker, and he could put people together and get them to do what he wanted to. He was a strong-arm guy. He liked to meet people at the bar and have a drink and get them to agree what he wanted to do. A whole bunch of stuff going on. He worked the telephone real well. And he was the person that ultimately took over when JFK was killed. He wanted to continue the social programs predominantly of JFK because it was his legacy. He didn't want to go in. This was a loved president. The United States had just taken a huge hit by his assassination, so he didn't want to rock the boat much. So what he does, though, is he uses his experience with being able to kind of move bills through Congress and work Congress to his advantage to really get things moving. He is, even though he's from Texas, he's a Southern legislator and ultimately vice president and president, he becomes pretty committed to social reform and moving in a liberal direction on a lot of issues that you wouldn't think a guy from Texas during the 1960s would do. The first thing he does is he declares a war on poverty. This is the first big issue within the Great Society, a war on poverty. And he starts a number of programs that the government is taking over to try to take care of people that are impoverished around our country. And I want you to think about this again as kind of an extension of the New Deal. So the same kind of, LBJ loved Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He wanted to kind of do the same kind of things, really use government to make the lives of people better. So he instituted a number of different things that are around still today. The Economic Opportunity Act, the Job Corps, Volunteer Service to America, which is what runs the Peace Corps, a number of different things to try to help out people and eliminate poverty. He also really looks at healthcare as well. He's one of the very first presidents to really take a good look at healthcare and make the government responsible for some of the healthcare responsibilities. And he does that through what's called Medicare and Medicaid. And those two programs were actually built in the 1960s. They were passed by Congress in 1965, and we still have them today. So Medicare is health care coverage for the elderly. So once people get older, he said, we really need to be able to take care of them. And then Medicaid is medical insurance for low-income families. And so that these two groups of Americans would be taken care of in terms of health care was a real legacy of LBJ. He also is big on education and the environment. He starts what's called Head Start in 1965. Again, still a program that we have today, and this is to help fund preschool programs for low-income families. So rather than just having kids not have a kind of a leg up until they get to kindergarten or first grade, this would be a way that when they were very young, they would still have access to good education so that they could hit the primary school ready to go. He also passes the Clean Water Quality Act and the Clean Air Act in 1965, which focuses on industrial pollution and makes it impossible for large businesses and things to pollute the environment anymore. And that will then be followed up by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, under Richard Nixon. Probably the biggest area that, in terms of his domestic policy, that Johnson does is based on civil rights. And we'll talk a lot more about this when we talk about civil rights in an upcoming lesson. But just to give you an idea, again, this is a white male guy from Texas who then is partnering with Martin Luther King and a number of civil rights leaders to create civil rights legislation. It's really pretty amazing that he's able to do this, given his background. He brings the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into fruition that bans discrimination of any kind within the federal government. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which makes sure that there's voting rights for African Americans and that they're not disenfranchised. And then the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, making sure that you can't discriminate in the workplace based on race or gender. So this not only impacts people of minorities, but also women as well. So Lyndon Johnson is an interesting character because if you look at the things that I just talked about, you would think, wow, he really did a lot. He got a lot done for the United States. A lot of those are pretty progressive things that we're still counting on today. He really utilized the power of the federal government to help disadvantaged people. But it came at a cost, literally a cost, because it cost a lot of money. And so one of the things it did is it made the budget significantly greater, put stress on programs, put stress on taxes, frustrated a lot of people that didn't think that we should be taxed as much as we are, and really got us into this issue of Democrats are for big government and big spending, and Republicans are for small government and small spending, which we still deal with that kind of dichotomy today. The other thing that happened is that his domestic and issues, all these things that he wanted to do to try to make America better, were clouded by issues going on in the 1960s. Again, the 60s are a turbulent time, especially the late 60s, and we'll get more into that in later lessons. But there's a lot of stuff going on. A lot of people are disagreeing with how the country's being run. And we're also embroiled in the middle of a war as well in Vietnam. And so not only the Vietnam War, but the protest around that war, free speech requirements, the civil rights issues, feminism that becomes really important in the late 60s, early 70s, and then the hippie movement, or the movement of people kind of thinking about trying to define roles differently, all get in the way of his ability to really focus on what he wants to, which is the poor and the folks that are left behind in America. And we will be seeing that in subsequent lessons. So that's a little information about both the New Society and the Great Society and the New Frontier, and we'll talk more about these issues in the rest of the lesson.